On August 14, 2023, at 2:17 in the afternoon, Brett Hartman descended past 412 feet below the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, 89 miles due west of Key West, Florida. He was 39 years old, a technical cave diver certified since 2009, with over 2,200 logged dives in his career. Brett was there on a contract job, mapping geological formations for a private company called Nauticore Research. His equipment was exactly what the depth required: trimix gas mix at 18% oxygen, a closed-circuit rebreather, a 4K helmet camera, and a portable sonar unit strapped to his left forearm. The water temperature was 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility was decent, around 40 feet, with moderate current flowing southeast. At 412 feet, Brett's sonar pinged something that made him stop mid-descent. The reading showed a cavity in the limestone formation ahead, roughly 85 feet across, shaped in a perfect hexagon. Natural erosion doesn't create hexagons. He adjusted his position, moved closer, and found an opening carved into the rock face. The entrance was 9 feet in diameter, almost perfectly circular, with edges cut at 90-degree angles to the surrounding stone. Brett's helmet lights swept across the interior, and that's when he saw them. Symbols. Geometric patterns, astronomical markings carved into the walls of a corridor that extended 30 feet into the rock. But here's what shouldn't be possible. At this depth, after thousands of years underwater, every surface should be covered in sediment, barnacles, coral growth, layers of biological material. These symbols looked fresh, clean, as if someone had carved them months ago, not millennia. Brett touched the wall with his gloved hand. The stone was smooth, almost polished. And it was warm, 72 degrees in 68-degree water. Brett Hartman wasn't some weekend recreational diver stumbling into something over his head. He was an instructor at Ginnie Springs, one of the most respected cave diving facilities in Florida, where he'd been teaching advanced technical diving for 11 years. He was divorced, father to a 14-year-old daughter named Olivia, who lived with her mother in Gainesville. Brett saw Olivia every other weekend, and they'd go diving together in the springs when the weather was good. She had her junior open water certification, and Brett was already planning to get her trained for cavern diving when she turned 16. Outside of diving instruction, Brett worked part-time as a forensic dive consultant for county police departments across northern Florida. When someone drove their car into a lake, when evidence needed to be recovered from river bottoms, when bodies needed to be found in submerged vehicles, they called Brett. He'd mapped underwater crime scenes, documented wreckage, testified in court about water currents and decomposition rates. The man knew how to stay calm under pressure, how to follow protocol, how to document what he saw with precision. And on weekends, Brett volunteered his time teaching diving to military veterans dealing with post-traumatic stress. Something about being underwater, weightless, breathing slowly, seemed to help them. He'd seen guys who couldn't sleep through the night on land go down to 60 feet and find peace for the first time in years. Brett understood water. He understood stone. He understood time and erosion and how the ocean interacts with everything it touches. So when he saw symbols that looked carved yesterday at the entrance to a chamber 412 feet below the surface, in a location that should have been undisturbed for 12,000 years, he knew something was fundamentally wrong. The contract from Nauticore Research had come through normal channels. They'd contacted him 3 weeks prior, said they were conducting a geological survey of limestone formations in the Gulf, needed an experienced technical diver for deep mapping work. The pay was good, $1,500 per dive day, and the work sounded straightforward. Brett's surface team that day consisted of Kayla Chen, his safety diver and backup, and Brennan Wade, the boat captain who'd been running dive charters out of Key West for 23 years. They were positioned directly above him, monitoring his dive computer telemetry, ready to respond if anything went wrong. Brett carried a trimix blend specifically calculated for 412 feet, using a closed-circuit rebreather that recycled his breathing gas and extended his bottom time. His 4K camera was recording everything. His sonar was logging every measurement. This was a professional operation by the book, nothing reckless. And now, Brett was staring at an entrance that shouldn't exist, covered in symbols that shouldn't be visible, leading into darkness that suddenly felt very different from any cave he'd ever explored. Brett checked his dive computer. He had 28 minutes of bottom time remaining at this depth before he'd need to begin his ascent for decompression. The smart move would be to document the entrance, mark the GPS coordinates, surface, and report what he'd found. But the corridor was right there, 30 feet deep according to his sonar, and the symbols on those walls represented something that would rewrite everything we know about pre-agricultural civilization. He made the decision in about 5 seconds. Brett activated his chest-mounted backup light, double-checked his gas mix readings, and entered the corridor. The walls closed in around him, 8 feet wide, smooth stone on all sides, carved with geometric precision that would be impressive in a modern tunnel, let alone something supposedly 12,000 years old. The symbols were everywhere. Circles intersecting triangles, star patterns with 7 points, something that looked almost like a calendar with concentric rings marking divisions of time. Brett moved slowly, his fins barely moving, hands tracing along the wall to steady himself in the slight current that flowed through the passage. 30 feet in, exactly as the sonar had measured, the corridor opened into a central chamber. The space was massive. 40 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling rising 15 feet above the floor. Every surface covered in the same pristine symbols that showed no biological growth, no sediment accumulation, nothing that should naturally occur after millennia underwater. In the exact center of the chamber stood a cylindrical structure, 6 feet tall and maybe 3 feet in diameter, made of a material Brett couldn't identify. It wasn't stone. It had the smooth surface of polished metal, but without any of the corrosion you'd expect from saltwater exposure. It wasn't volcanic rock. It wasn't limestone or granite or basalt. The surface was a dark gray color, almost black, with a faint pattern of hexagonal cells covering it like honeycomb, each cell about the size of a quarter. Brett approached slowly, his helmet camera recording every detail, his sonar unit pinging measurements, documenting the impossible geometry of what he was seeing. He reached out with his right hand and touched the cylinder's surface. It was smooth, completely smooth, no texture at all despite the hexagonal pattern visible on it, and it was warm. Not just warmer than the surrounding water, but actually warm, 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees above ambient water temperature. At 412 feet below the surface, in a sealed chamber that should be the same temperature as everything around it, with no thermal vents, no volcanic activity, no possible heat source, this object was warmer than it should be. That's when Brett's dive computer started malfunctioning. The depth reading on his wrist display flickered, jumped to 890 feet, then back to 412, then to 890 again. Brett hadn't moved. He was stationary, one hand on the cylinder, the other holding the wall for stability. But his computer insisted he was descending and ascending hundreds of feet per second, which was physically impossible. The water temperature reading changed. 68 degrees became 71, then 74, then 76 degrees Fahrenheit, all within 15 seconds. Brett could feel it through his wetsuit, a subtle warmth spreading through the chamber, like someone had turned on a heater he couldn't see. His helmet lights reflected off something behind the cylinder, a movement in the shadows at the back of the chamber where his lights couldn't quite reach. Something shifted position, something large enough to displace water, creating a pressure wave Brett felt against his chest. His training kicked in immediately. When you encounter something unexpected underwater, especially at technical depths, you don't investigate further. You exit, you surface, you report, you let people with robots and remote cameras figure out what happens next. Brett pushed off the cylinder, turned toward the corridor entrance, and that's when his camera caught something his eyes had missed in the darkness. On the right wall of the chamber, near the floor, there were scratches in the stone. Fresh scratches. Tool marks. The kind of gouges you get from metal equipment scraping against limestone, bright white stone showing through the darker patina, no biological growth in the marks at all. Someone had been here recently. Not 12,000 years ago. Recently. With modern tools. Brett finalized his exit, moved through the 30-foot corridor faster than he'd entered, and cleared the entrance back into open water. His heart was pounding. His breathing rate had increased. Not panic, but serious concern. The kind that comes from realizing you've stumbled into something that people with authority and resources clearly wanted, kept quiet. Brett began his ascent at 2:41 in the afternoon, following decompression protocol with absolute precision, because rushing to the surface from 412 feet will kill you faster than whatever was moving in that chamber. The ascent would take 3 hours and 15 minutes total, with mandatory stops at specific depths to allow nitrogen to safely leave his bloodstream. At 200 feet, he stopped for 8 minutes. At 150 feet, another 12 minutes. At 100 feet, 18 minutes. At 70 feet, 22 minutes. During these stops, suspended in blue water, with nothing to do but breathe slowly and wait, Brett reviewed the footage on his underwater tablet, a ruggedized screen connected to his helmet camera that let him scrub through recorded video. He watched himself enter the corridor, watched the camera pan across those impossibly clean symbols, watched his gloved hand touch the warm cylinder, watched the dive computer readings jump erratically on his wrist display. He used the tablet's GPS function to mark the exact coordinates of the chamber entrance, double-checked the numbers, saved them to 3 separate backup files. At 30 feet, his longest decompression stop, 45 minutes hanging on an anchor line while his body slowly equalized, Brett had time to think about what happens next. Document everything. Report to the client. Let the archaeologists and the universities fight over what it means. That was the plan. He surfaced at 5:42 in the evening, 3 hours and 1 minute after he'd started his descent, exactly on schedule for a dive of that depth and duration. Kayla Chen was waiting at the surface, already in her wetsuit, ready to go down if Brett had signaled any kind of emergency during the dive. She helped him onto the boat's dive platform, got his rebreather unit off his back, and Brett could see the concern on her face before she even spoke. "You saw something bad," she said. Not a question, a statement, reading his body language the way safety divers learn to do. Brennan Wade cut the engine and came back from the helm, a 46-year-old career boat captain with sun-damaged skin and 23 years of running dive charters, who'd seen enough divers surface with strange stories that he knew when to take someone seriously. Brett peeled off his wetsuit hood, pulled the tablet from its waterproof case, and showed them the footage. The three of them watched in silence, the tablet screen bright in the late afternoon sun, As the video played through the corridor, the chamber, the cylinder, the temperature anomalies, the movement in the shadows, Kayla said what Brett was thinking. That's not natural formation. Brennan pointed at the timestamp on the depth gauge malfunction. 412 to 890 feet in 2 seconds. That's impossible. Your computer's broken or something down there was messing with the electronics. Brett shook his head. Computer ran diagnostics during decompression. No malfunctions detected. Whatever happened down there, it happened. He made the decision quickly, because waiting made no sense. Brett pulled his waterproof phone from the boat's dry storage, dialed the number for Dr. Shannon Voss, the marine archaeologist from Nauticore Research who'd hired him for this job, the woman who'd signed his contract, and briefed him on what kind of geological formations to document. Dr. Voss answered on the second ring. Her voice sounded tense immediately, not the casual tone she'd used in their previous calls. "Brett, what did you find?" He hadn't said anything yet. Hadn't identified himself. Hadn't explained why he was calling. But she knew. "There's a chamber," Brett said. 412 feet down, carved into the limestone, covered in symbols that look fresh, with a structure in the center made of material I can't identify. And my dive computer went haywire when I touched it. There was silence on the other end of the line for maybe 5 seconds, long enough to be uncomfortable. When Dr. Voss spoke again, her voice had changed, more formal, more careful. "Did you document the location?" Brett said yes. "Did you share this information with anyone else?" Brett looked at Kayla and Brennan, both listening to his side of the conversation. "Just my surface team." Another pause. "Listen to me very carefully, Brett. Do not share this with anyone else. Do not post anything online. Do not call any other agencies. I'm going to come to your location personally, and we'll discuss what happens next. I can be there in a few hours. Can you hold position until then?" Brett agreed, because that seemed reasonable. Dr. Voss ended the call. The sun was getting lower on the horizon. Brennan started organizing the dive equipment. Kayla went below deck to make coffee. Everything felt normal, except for the knot in Brett's stomach that told him nothing about this was going to be normal at all. At 7:18 in the evening, 1 hour and 36 minutes after Brett had surfaced, a research vessel appeared on the horizon, moving fast, heading directly toward their position. Brennan saw it first on radar, called Brett and Kayla up to the helm to look. The vessel was large, 80 feet at least, with the distinctive profile of a NOAA research ship, white hull with the agency logo visible even at distance. Brett felt confused before he felt concerned. He'd never contacted NOAA. Dr. Voss had said she'd come personally, not that she'd send a federal agency. As the vessel approached, Brett could see 6 people on deck, all wearing tactical gear, not research equipment, carrying cases that looked more like military deployment kits than scientific instruments. The vessel pulled alongside Brett's boat, close enough to read the name stenciled on the hull. No name, just a registration number. A man in his 50s, gray hair cut military short, stepped to the rail and spoke with absolute authority. "I'm Commander Hayes. We're taking custody of this situation under federal environmental protection protocols. We need all of your recording equipment, GPS data, dive computers, and any devices that may have documented your dive today." Brett looked at Kayla, then at Brennan, then back at Commander Hayes. "How did you know I was here?" Hayes ignored the question completely. "Sir, this is not a negotiation. The area you dove today has been flagged as environmentally sensitive. We're confiscating your equipment for analysis and issuing a formal restriction on any further diving activity within 5 nautical miles of these coordinates. 2 members of Hayes's team were already boarding Brett's boat without asking permission. They took everything: the 4K camera, the helmet unit, the dive computer, the sonar device, the underwater tablet, Brett's wetsuit, his fins, his rebreather. They took Brennan's boat logs and navigation computer. They took Kayla's safety diver records. One of the boarding team members, a younger guy, maybe 30 years old, had an equipment patch on his shoulder that didn't quite match the others. Underneath a hastily applied No AA patch, Brett could see the edge of another logo, red and white text that said Deep Tech Marine Solutions, a private salvage company, not a federal agency. Commander Hayes handed Brett a document. 3 pages printed on official federal letterhead. A non-disclosure agreement with legal language that basically said if Brett talked about what he'd found, he'd face criminal prosecution under environmental protection statutes. "You're free to go," Hayes said. "Head northeast. Maintain at least 15 nautical miles from this location. The area will be officially restricted by federal order within 4 hours." Brett signed the document because 6 people with federal authority on a boat twice the size of his didn't leave much room for argument. As Brennan fired up the engine and turned northeast, Brett watched the NOAA vessel, or whatever it actually was, drop anchor directly above the coordinates where the chamber was located. They'd brought down a remote-operated vehicle, a deep-water ROV, which meant they were going down to see what Brett had found. Which meant they already knew what was down there. Which meant Dr. Shannon Voss had never planned to show up at all. Brett spent the next 3 days trying to make sense of what had happened, and the more he dug, the less sense anything made. He started with Nauticore Research, the company that had hired him, the company that supposedly needed geological surveys of limestone formations in the Gulf. Their website looked professional enough: clean design, stock photos of research vessels and underwater mapping equipment, a mission statement about advancing marine archaeology through innovative technology. But when Brett ran their corporate registration through Florida's business database, he found something strange. Nauticore Research had been incorporated 8 months ago, in December of 2022, with a registered address in Tampa that turned out to be a virtual office service, the kind of place that rents mailboxes and forwards calls for $50 a month. No physical location, no staff directory, no published research, no peer-reviewed papers. The company didn't exist in any meaningful sense before they'd contacted Brett. Next, he looked into Dr. Shannon Voss, the woman who'd hired him, the marine archaeologist with the Stanford credentials. Her doctorate was real. Brett confirmed that through Stanford's alumni database, graduated in 2014 with a dissertation on Paleolithic coastal settlements. But Dr. Voss didn't work in marine archaeology. According to her LinkedIn profile, which she'd updated as recently as 6 months ago, she worked as a materials research scientist for a Department of Defense contractor in Huntsville, Alabama, specializing in something called advanced composite analysis for aerospace applications. That's not marine archaeology. That's not even close to marine archaeology. That's metallurgy and materials engineering for military aerospace projects. Brett called a colleague in Miami, a commercial diver named Carlos who'd been working Gulf salvage operations for 15 years and knew everyone in the technical diving community from Key West to Pensacola. "You ever heard of Nauticore Research?" Brett asked. Carlos laughed. "Man, you're not the first person to ask me about them. You dove something weird, didn't you?" Brett felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean I'm not the first?" Carlos sent him a link to a forum for technical cave divers, a private message board where people shared dive site information and safety reports. The thread was from 2018, 5 years ago, archived but still accessible if you knew where to look. A diver named Derek Morrison had posted about finding a chamber with geometric symbols carved into limestone walls at a depth of 460 feet, approximately 140 miles south of where Brett had dove. Derek's description matched exactly what Brett had seen. The hexagonal chamber, the pristine symbols, the cylindrical structure in the center, the equipment malfunctions. Derek had posted his findings, asked if anyone knew what historical civilization could have created something like that, and then, 3 days later, his account went inactive. All his posts were deleted except for this one that had been archived by another user before it disappeared. Brett searched for Derek Morrison online, found him on LinkedIn. Last listed employer, Deep Tech Marine Solutions. The same company whose logo Brett had seen partially covered on the equipment patch of one of Commander Hayes' boarding team members. The pressure started 48 hours after Brett's dive. 2 men showed up at his house in High Springs, introduced themselves as security consultants working for an unnamed federal contractor, and offered Brett $75,000 to sign an expanded non-disclosure agreement that would prevent him from discussing the dive with anyone, including lawyers, for a period of 25 years. Brett refused. He had a 14-year-old daughter to think about, and signing something like that felt wrong in ways he couldn't fully articulate, but knew he needed to trust. 2 days later, his mortgage company sent a notice saying his loan had been accelerated and full payment was due in 30 days, or the house would enter foreclosure. No explanation, no missed payments. His account was current. When Brett called to dispute it, the bank representative said the decision came from their legal compliance department and was not subject to appeal. That same afternoon, his employer at Ginnie Springs Dive Center called him into the office and said they were putting him on indefinite unpaid leave. Something about insurance liability concerns, wouldn't specify what that meant. Brett had worked there for 11 years without incident. His safety record was spotless. None of this made sense until you understood that someone with resources and authority wanted Brett to shut up and disappear, and they were willing to systematically dismantle his life to make that happen. His ex-wife called him that evening, her voice shaking. People were asking about you at Olivia's school today. Men in suits. They wanted to know her schedule, what activities she does after school, if she ever goes diving with you. Brett, what the hell is going on? That night, at 11:37, Brett received a message on Signal, the encrypted messaging app he used for coordinating technical dive operations. The sender had no profile picture, no username, just a random string of numbers. The message contained a single attachment, a PDF document, 43 pages long, stamped on every page with the words "Classified, Top Secret, Project Deep Chronos." Brett opened it and started reading. The document was dated March of 2024, just 5 months ago, authored by a Navy research division Brett had never heard of, addressed to officials at the Department of Defense and the National Security Agency. The summary section, written in dense technical language, explained that since 1997, the United States Navy had been systematically mapping a network of 14 underwater chambers located around the Caribbean Basin, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. The chambers were structurally identical. Hexagonal formations carved into limestone or volcanic rock, at depths ranging from 380 to 520 feet, each containing a cylindrical structure in the center made of a material that resisted all standard forms of analysis. Carbon dating of biological material found near the chambers suggested they were constructed between 11,800 and 12,400 years ago, which placed them at the end of the last ice age, a period when human civilization supposedly consisted of hunter-gatherer tribes that had barely figured out agriculture. But here's where the document stopped being about ancient history and became about the present. The material analysis section described something impossible. The cylindrical structures were made of a metallic alloy containing isotope ratios that don't occur naturally on Earth, specifically isotopes of titanium and vanadium that would require neutron bombardment in conditions that don't exist outside of supernova explosions or advanced particle accelerators. And then the final section, the one that made Brett's hands shake as he read it, explained that the chambers weren't dormant. In March of 2019, satellites operated by the National Reconnaissance Office detected synchronized electromagnetic pulses emanating from all 14 known chamber locations, pulsing at intervals of 72 hours, all perfectly synchronized despite being separated by thousands of miles of ocean. The chambers weren't ancient artifacts. They were active. They were operational. And someone, or something, had turned them on. Brett sat in his living room until 3 in the morning reading that document, then reading it again, trying to reconcile what it said with everything he thought he understood about human history and the physical limitations of ancient technology. By October of 2023, 2 months after his dive, Brett had signed a formal non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a financial settlement that reinstated his mortgage, restored his employment at Ginny Springs, and made the security consultants stop visiting his daughter's school. The conditions were explicit and non-negotiable. Brett could never dive in federal waters off the coast of Florida again. He could never discuss what he'd found with anyone outside of authorized government personnel. He could never attempt to return to the coordinates where the chamber was located. Violation of any of these terms would result in immediate prosecution under the Espionage Act, with penalties including up to 20 years in federal prison. Brett signed because protecting his daughter mattered more than being right about ancient mysteries, and because fighting the United States government with their unlimited resources and legal authority was a battle he couldn't win. Kayla Chen, his safety diver that day, signed a similar agreement and moved to Oregon 3 weeks later, took a job managing a recreational dive shop in Portland, where the deepest water she'd ever see again was maybe 60 feet in local quarries. Brennan Wade, the boat captain, refused to sign anything. He said they could take his boat, take his commercial captain's license, take whatever they wanted, but they couldn't make him lie about what he'd witnessed. 2 months later, the Coast Guard confiscated his vessel for alleged safety violations, and the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation revoked his maritime license, effectively ending a career that had spanned 23 years without a single serious incident. Derek Morrison, the diver who'd found a similar chamber back in 2018, effectively disappeared from public record. His LinkedIn profile was deleted. His phone number was disconnected. When Brett managed to track down Derek's sister through Facebook, she said Derek was traveling abroad for work and couldn't be reached, but her tone suggested she'd been told to say that and didn't necessarily believe it herself. The archived forum post from 2018, the one where Derek had described the hexagonal chamber and the cylindrical structure and the equipment malfunctions, matched Brett's experience in every significant detail, which meant at minimum 2 separate divers had found 2 separate chambers, and both had been silenced through pressure and intimidation and legal threats. In September of 2020, a post appeared on Reddit in a forum dedicated to underwater mysteries, posted by an anonymous account that lasted exactly 6 hours before being permanently suspended. The post included sonar images allegedly taken from a Navy P-3 Orion maritime surveillance aircraft, showing 14 distinct locations marked with designations from Site Alpha through Site November, scattered across the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and the eastern Mediterranean. The images showed depth measurements, GPS coordinates, and notations about electromagnetic anomaly detection at each location. The post was deleted. The images were scrubbed from Reddit's servers, but several users had downloaded the files before deletion, and metadata analysis of the photographs confirmed they were taken from military reconnaissance equipment, authenticated by experts who examine this kind of data professionally. An oceanographer who'd worked for NOAA for 32 years before retiring in 2021 appeared on a podcast about unexplained ocean phenomena and said, very carefully, that the Navy had been studying something in deep water that predates any known civilization and appears to be operational rather than archaeological. But when pressed for details, he declined to elaborate and ended the interview abruptly. In March of 2024, leaked satellite data posted briefly on a whistleblower website showed electromagnetic pulse activity from the 14 known chamber locations had increased in frequency, going from pulses every 72 hours to pulses every 48 hours, suggesting whatever system these chambers were part of was becoming more active over time. By June of 2024, the Navy had expanded the restricted zones around each known site from 5 nautical miles to 25 nautical miles, effectively closing off huge sections of ocean to civilian vessels and recreational diving under environmental protection laws that provided no real explanation for why these specific areas suddenly needed protection. In August of 2024, Brett received another anonymous contact, this time through an encrypted email account, offering him $200,000 to return to the chamber site as a civilian consultant for what they described as a national security research initiative. Brett declined. Whatever was down there, whatever those chambers were, whatever had built them 12,000 years ago or was reactivating them now, Brett had a daughter who needed her father more than the world needed answers to questions that terrified him. In September of 2024, leaked footage from a Navy remote-operated vehicle, posted anonymously and quickly removed, showed the interior of a chamber that matched Brett's description perfectly: the hexagonal walls, the pristine symbols, the domed ceiling. But the cylindrical structure, the 6-foot-tall object that had been in the center when Brett dove there, was gone. The chamber was empty. Something had removed it, or it had removed itself, and nobody was saying what that meant. Here's what we know. 14 chambers exist in deep water around the Caribbean and Mediterranean, built 12,000 years ago by someone with technology that shouldn't have existed, made of materials that shouldn't exist naturally on Earth. The chambers have been reactivating since March of 2019, sending synchronized electromagnetic pulses that satellites can detect from orbit. The United States government has been studying them since at least 1997 and has gone to extreme lengths to prevent information about them from reaching the public. Multiple divers who've found these chambers have been silenced through legal pressure, financial coercion, and systematic destruction of their professional lives. And whatever was inside those cylinders, the structures at the center of each chamber, is no longer there. Here's what we don't know. Who built these chambers when human civilization supposedly consisted of small hunter-gatherer tribes? Why are they reactivating now, synchronizing across thousands of miles of ocean? What was inside those cylinders, and where did they go? And why is a government that prides itself on transparency willing to threaten its own citizens with prosecution under the Espionage Act to keep this secret? Brett Hartman still lives in High Springs, Florida. He still teaches diving at Ginny Springs, but only in shallow water now, only in controlled environments where the deepest he goes is maybe 80 feet. He sees his daughter every other weekend. He doesn't talk about what he found. But Brett kept something that nobody knows about, something he didn't mention in any of his statements or interviews or legal depositions. When he touched that cylinder at 412 feet below the surface, a small fragment broke off, about the size of a quarter, smooth and dark and impossibly light for metal. He keeps it in a safe deposit box at a bank in Gainesville. And some nights, when he can't sleep, he drives there and opens the box just to check. The fragment is still there, but it hums now, a low vibration he can feel in his fingers when he holds it, and it's getting warmer.